Okay, in this video, I will create a chart that can show the relationship between risk and return of a portfolio. So what we want in a chart is to show the relationship between risk and return. So I will create a chart here. So in a capital asset pricing model, we usually put the risk on the x-axis and return on the y-axis. And we want to show the relationship between risk and return of a portfolio given the base asset. So in our case, we have the Netflix and the Walmart. So in case of Netflix, the weekly return, expected return was a 0.43%. So Netflix has a slightly higher return than the Walmart that had a weekly return of 0.28. So let's say this is a Walmart, right? So in case of Walmart, this return is lower. It's a 0.28, right? But it has a lower risk too. So when you look at the standard deviation of the return is 2.86%. Right? Compared to that, when you look at the Netflix has a higher return, which is 0.43%. So let's say this is Netflix. So Netflix has a higher return, which is 0.43%. And it also has higher risk, which is 8.6%. Okay, so what we want to show in a chart is to show how much the portfolio made out of these two assets can actually reduce the risk and at the same time improve the rate of return. So because we assume that all the investors are risk averse, right? That means that given the risk, they want to maximize the return, and given the return, they actually want to minimize the risk. So given the return, right? Given the value of the y-axis variable, they want to actually minimize the risk. Okay. And also, given the risk, given the value of the x-axis variable, they want to maximize the return. So it would be really nice if we can find a portfolio that can move to the left and up in the graph, because this is a linear combination of Walmart stock and the Netflix stock. And if we can do better than the linear combination of the Walmart and the Netflix stock by creating a portfolio between the two, that would be great, because given the rate of return, we can either reduce the risk, or given the risk, we can increase the rate of return. Okay, so that's what we are looking for. So in the chart, we want to show how much of an improvement the portfolio between Netflix and the Walmart can create. Okay. To create a chart of portfolio risk and return, one of the first things that we have to do is to calculate the correlation coefficient between the two assets. In the previous video, we already calculated the covariance between the Netflix asset and the Walmart asset. So all that we have to do is to use the information that is already provided and calculate the correlation coefficient. I'm not sure if you guys remember exactly what the correlation coefficient was. So to refresh your memory, correlation coefficient between the two assets, so in this case, Netflix and the Walmart, is the covariance between the Netflix and the Walmart divided by standard deviation of the Netflix times the standard deviation of the Walmart. And the main difference between the correlation coefficient and the covariance is that covariance is not covariance is a unit sensitive. So when the unit of measurement change, covariance will change. Compared to that, the correlation coefficient is not unit sensitive. It's very similar to the elasticity, the concept of elasticity. So correlation coefficient has a value ranges between -1 and the +1. So just by looking at the value of a correlation coefficient, we can easily identify the relationship between the two variables. In case of the covariance, whenever the unit of measurement change, the value of the covariance change. And because of that, simply by looking at the value of the covariance, we cannot really infer exactly how strong the relationship between the two variables is. So I would say the correlation coefficient is a more clear concept than the covariance, and that's the reason why we prefer the correlation coefficient to the covariance. Now, given the relationship between correlation coefficient and the covariance, we can easily calculate the correlation coefficient. So the correlation coefficient is the covariance between the two assets divided by standard deviation of Netflix times the standard deviation of the Walmart. So we have to actually put a parenthesis between the two. Then we can easily get the correlation coefficient between the two variables. So we can see that the correlation coefficient between the Netflix stock and the Walmart stock is -0.05, which means that these two assets are, slightly inversely correlated, and they are not strongly correlated, right? Now, to create a risk-return chart of a portfolio, the first thing that we have to do is change the weight of each asset in the portfolio, and then calculate the rate of return and the risk of a portfolio for each weight. So for that, I changed the share of each asset here, so that the sum of the weights in the asset weights in the portfolio is equal to 1. So here, Netflix weight, so 20% of the money is invested in Netflix, and the weight of Walmart is 1 minus that, so that the sum of the weight is always equal to 1. And what I'm going to do here is that I will change the weight of the Netflix asset from 100%, and then gradually reduce the weight of Netflix asset to 90%, to 80%, and so on. Okay. Then the share of the Walmart asset will also change accordingly. Okay. So given the weight, then we can actually calculate the rate of return of your portfolio. And I hope you remember the rate of return of the portfolio is simple weighted average of the return of each asset in the portfolio. So when you put all of your money in Netflix asset, then the return of your portfolio is share of the Netflix times the return of the Netflix asset, and I'll fix this, plus 1 minus the share of the Netflix asset times the return of the Walmart asset, right? And when you press enter, you can see that in this case, because you put all of your money in Netflix stock, the return of your portfolio is equal to the return of the Netflix stock, right? Then I will just drag this over. And when none of your money is invested in the Netflix and all of your money is invested in Walmart, and obviously the return of your portfolio is equal to the return of the Walmart stock. Okay, Then the next step is to calculate the risk of your portfolio. And as you remember, calculating the risk is a little bit more complicated because the risk of your portfolio depends on the share of each asset in your portfolio, risk of each asset in your portfolio, and either the covariance or the correlation coefficient between the two assets, right? So the first thing that we have to do is we get the share of each asset and square it and multiply the variance of each asset. Then 1 minus the share of the Netflix squared times the variance of Walmart plus 2 times the share of each asset times the standard deviation of each asset and the correlation coefficient between the two assets. Okay. Then we will have to fix the reference to the absolute reference for all the variance, standard deviation, and the correlation coefficient. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to fix this, and correlation coefficient, standard deviation, and this the standard deviation. So when I press enter, you can see that now when you put all of your money in Netflix stock, the risk of your portfolio is equal to the risk and the variance of the Netflix stock, right? Then I will again hold this and drag it over. Okay. And you can see that when all of your money is put in the Walmart stock, the risk of your portfolio is equal to the risk of the Walmart stock, right? And then when you actually see what happens between 0% and the 10%, right? For example, so when you put all of your money in the Walmart stock, your rate of return is at 0.28%, risk is 0.08%, right? Then when you put 10% of your money in the Netflix stock and 90% of your money in the Walmart, your rate of return actually goes up from 0.28 to 0.3, and your risk actually falls from 0.08% to 0.07%, right? So you can actually see the benefit of diversification in this case. Okay. Once we set this up, because the precise measure of the risk is not really the variance, it's the standard deviation, we can just take the square root of the entire variance. Right? Then you can see that the standard deviation of your portfolio is equal to the standard deviation of the Netflix stock in this case. And then double click this, and you can see all the variances change to a standard deviation. Now that we have the risk and return of the portfolio for each weight, all that we have to do is to insert a chart. So go to the insert menu and choose a chart. So I will choose the scatter plot with a smooth line, and I will move the chart so that you can see the data. Okay. And go to select data and click add. So portfolio, return risk, right? And as I told you before, we will use the risk as an x-axis variable. So select x values, and x value is the risk, and the y value is the return.
and press OK. Okay, and now you can see the risk and return profile of your portfolio, and this doesn't look the best because the the y-axis variable has too much variance. So I will just change the range of the y-axis variable. So because the most of the change is within 0.2% and 0.43%, I will just change the minimum value to 0.2%. Okay. Then you can see a better chart. Okay. So what you can see here is, first, this is the Walmart, right? So Walmart has the return of 0.28% and the risk of 2.86%, right? And this is Netflix. So as you gradually increase the share of the Netflix from here, so here you are holding 100% of the Walmart and 0% of the Netflix, right? And when you increase the share of the Netflix from 0 to 10%, we move from here to here. And I told you moving left and up is very important, because when you move to the left, you are reducing the risk while holding the return constant. When you move up, you are increasing the return while holding the risk constant. So when you move to the left and up, it means that you are reducing the risk and at the same time increase the return, which is the best possible outcome. So you can see that when you increase the share of the Netflix asset from 0% to 10%, you can actually gain a important improvement by reducing the risk and at the same time improving the return. Okay, so that's what we can easily see by creating this chart. And another good thing about creating a chart like this is we can easily see how important the correlation coefficient between the two assets is. So in this case, the actual correlation coefficient between the two assets was negative 0.05. And this chart is created based off of that correlation coefficient. But we can see what happens to this risk and return profile when the correlation coefficient between the two assets is not negative 0.05. For example, what happens when the correlation coefficient between the two is stronger and negative? So if this value is negative 0.5 instead of negative 0.05, then you can see that the risk and return profile change, and there is a greater movement to the left and up, right? So now we can create a better portfolio that has lower risk and promises greater return, right? And the extreme case is when the correlation coefficient between the two assets is negative 1, which means that these two assets have a negative and linear relationship, right? In that case, now we can move even further to the left, right? So theoretically, it is possible for you to create a portfolio out of two risky assets, a portfolio that doesn't really have a risk. So you can create a safe portfolio out of two risky assets if the two assets are perfectly and negatively correlated. And the opposite case is the case when the two assets have a positive and perfect correlation. So the correlation coefficient is positive 1. And then you can see that the risk and return profile of your portfolio becomes a straight line that connects the Walmart and the Netflix. And it means that you are not getting any benefit from diversification when these two assets have a perfectly positive correlation. So this is the case in which there is a zero benefit. From the diversification, okay? And so what this example illustrates is diversification is very important, right? When you do it well, it can reduce the risk and sometimes improve the return, right? But the benefit of the diversification really depends on the potential correlation coefficient between the assets in your portfolio, okay? And that's it for today, and I hope you found this video useful.